Today we're going to be learning line and wash watercolour techniques by sketching this robin. I'm going to take you through the key parts of shapes and contour and value using a couple of simple pens to create interesting marks before adding on our colours and understanding how layers and mixing might work, along with painterly marks which add a lot of fun and interest to our sketch. By the end you'll be super confident in your line and wash watercolour techniques, ready to tackle basically any scene. All you need to start your line and wash, your ink and watercolour journey, would be a pen or a couple of pens which are waterproof. So for example here I've got a 0.3 and a 0.5mm fine liner. These have nice, easy to control points, and they are pigment liners. That means they are waterproof. You can find out if your pen is waterproof literally by looking. So here it says indelible waterproof. It might also say something like archival ink. The reason that's important is because we put our ink on first before adding our watercolours. So for the watercolours, just having a couple of brushes to try out first is all you need. So for example here I've got a round brush. This is a size 12. It's quite a small size 12, but anything size 8 to 12 is a good starting point. And I've got a flat or an angled shader. This is a 3/8 of an inch. But again, anything from up to half an inch really is a good starting size. Underneath all of this I've got some watercolour paper. Now this is paper made by Etcher. It's half cotton, which means it will be nice and absorbent for our watercolours. It should stand up to lots of abuse with our brushes and our paints, which if we use normal paper just isn't the case. Normal paper will not do that well when adding water and watercolours to it. My watercolours, the exact colours are not important. Get an affordable set. I've reviewed things like the Meaden art set on this channel before, which is very affordable. You can also get things like the watercolour Cotman set and other beginner sets which are more than adequate to start your journey. Don't forget some water and often tissue, or I carry a little microfiber towel as an addition just to help control things sometimes. And now we're ready to go. So let's start thinking about the processes we're going to use for ink and watercolour sketching. So let's talk about ink first. I have two pens here, and the reason I have two pens is so that I can create a variety of lines. This 0.3 fine liner can do a series of fine lines depending on how hard I press, whereas the 0.5 can go significantly bolder and it can't go quite as light. So we have a couple of pens to make our line work a bit more varied, a bit more interesting. And I'll normally start with the smaller pen so that my line work is nice and subtle. And the first stage of ink and watercolour sketching is shapes, is creating a contour of our scene. So I'm going to write here shapes/contour. And this is where sketching with a pen or a pencil is really great. It's really quick, because even a complex scene, like let's say a street going down from us, that can be really quickly rendered by just finding the contour. So as soon as we find a contour, the contour is the outline, we know what this scene is about. So already we can tell this is a street. And if we add a few more contours in there, the contours of the windows, for example, perhaps contours of people on the street, we get more and more detail really quickly. Compare that to if we're painting. What you need to do is you don't draw lines, you build up patches of colour. So this street scene would have to be built up with a patch of colour here, a patch of colour there, another patch of colour here, and then there. And this obviously takes much longer. It's going to take a long time until these patches of colour build up to be an actual street. So that's why we take our pen as our first step, because it's a shortcut. It's a good shortcut, which means that we can create our scene really quickly. What we don't want to do is overdo things. So let's take today's lovely image, our robin, and see what we can do to start with our contour. So what we're looking for, as I said, is shapes within our contours, so we can analyse our robin. Perhaps a good starting place is to do a little fun now, a tiny sketch, where you can go, look, what's the shapes? We've got like a triangle for the beak. We've kind of got then a circle, then we've got another circle. We've got another sort of rectangle coming off, little triangle, and we're just like this identifying the key shapes we're looking for. Obviously I've gone out of my thumbnail a bit there, that's okay. And that means we can work out the sort of proportions a bit better. So I didn't fit it in there, so I need to be aware when I come over here of what I'm looking for. But having worked out these simple shapes really quickly, we can just go for it in our sort of area where we're going to create our finished sketch. So I'm going to rope off one side of the page and work over here for all of our finished area. And here, let's start in the same way. So we've got our little triangle for the beak. We're not worrying about colours, we're not worrying about anything except contours. So we can see a little contour line coming along here, which kind of separates the beak out. Then we've got basically a circle. We can see this circle is a bit too round, so actually the circle perhaps needs to be a bit flatter at the top. And that's how we learn from these, and then we can put it into practice over here. So we can start that off. And then we can see that actually the circle, if we analyse it a bit better, the circle actually comes in, it's concave here. So we can just give that little shape here, and then we end up very quickly into rather a big belly. And it's all right if we want to even exaggerate the size of that belly. That's all right. As an artist, you can make those changes. Then we've got that big belly coming out, and we might go, you know what, I think this line's too flat. The brilliant thing about being loose and light is that's not going to matter. We can just bring that line out, and we will make sense of this line later. Don't worry about little mistakes like that. We then come to the tail, and the tail's kind of got a bit coming out like so, and a bit coming out like so, hasn't it? So we've got the rest of the tail. Again, perhaps this bit comes in too much, and again, we'll just correct that, and it's okay to have these little mistakes in your sketch. They will be made sense of later. Over here we've got the eye, so we can just pop that in, kind of a little circle basically. And then the angle of the legs coming out like so, and they kind of sit right on a big chunk of wood, don't they? Which we can bring across like this. We can make this chunk of wood something which is a branch we can see the whole of, and then the claws, the talons just sit on that wood. And again, we can make better sense of them later. If we just mark them in, they'll come good at the end. So we've done already, that is it. That is our shapes and contour. Now the next thing we want to look at is the kind of tone and value going on, and that again is where our pen comes in really handy. So value, tone is the idea of blocking in shades. So value, if we do a value scale, we can separate this into 4 squares, and we go from 0 up to 3. And as we go up to 3, we get darker and darker, and we can do that by hatching. So we can come along like this and hatch, and see how by crossing over the hatching, this is cross hatching, we get darker and darker. So we go from light all the way up to dark. We can do this in other ways. So we can do little dots, pointillism. We can build them up. So in one corner we can have a really dark corner of this square, elsewhere it can be lighter, and that's just through building up more dots in one area. We could, for example, looking at our robin, we could use little feather-like marks, so we can kind of build up the idea of how we're going to get texture with these repeating little feather-like marks, and then we get more and more of them to create shadow. And that's where we're starting to think in our robin, where's the shadow? And we can literally now have a look, where's the, not necessarily just shadow, but the darker areas. So we can find some darker areas where this brown is. So we can just, on our thumbnail, we can hatch in all those darkest areas. We can also find there's a bit of shade under the wing here, even where it's grey or white, there's a bit of shade. And under here there's a bit. And then we can go back and go, well actually this is darker, so we double down on that hatching. And perhaps under here there's a bit as well. And where's the darkest? Well, the darkest is probably just here. So again, we can go up to value 3. And now our thumbnail here has a nice contour, nice shapes, and a reference for our values, a reference for being able to apply it immediately onto our bird here. So what we're going to do is find those areas again. And I like mapping them out. I like making my robin have a little bit more of an internal contour of all these different areas. Now these can be colour. So look, here's our area of orange, our lovely robin's chest. We can then do the same with these kind of greys over here where the grey and the brown meet. It kind of comes under here, doesn't it? And we've also got the shape of these kind of wings, these feathers here. But then we can also map out the shade. So down here there's an area of shade. We can map that out. Up the top there's also, I think, a bit of a darker patch up here. And down here there's probably, for me, these areas are a little bit darker. So we can kind of just break them apart. And now we can use some gentle hatching or textural marks to start introducing this idea. Now don't forget that we are going to, of course, also be adding some watercolour. So we don't need to do the entire of the textures here. But these textures are also a good time where we can make sense of some of these marks. So we made these little mistakes, so now they can become areas of shadow or light. So I said it doesn't matter if you make mistakes because you can just flip things around and change things up. Here we could actually use hatching. We could look, the hatching will fit the feathers pointing out, won't it? And we can do the same here. And then we can work out where's a darker area and we can double hatch that. We can combine these textural marks with a bit of hatching as well if we want, so we can do a dual approach. The key is to be reasonably consistent in the line weight, the line quality. So for example, if I'm hatching, I don't want to create hatching which looks like this and goes in all different directions and then is light and then is really bold. What you want is something consistent in the weight, consistent in the direction. So consistency is really key. But hopefully you can see it's rather a quick process to just build up some of these little feather-like marks. And I like being a little bit abstract with the kind of marks I'm making. Even where it's really light, there's still some texture. So just introducing these marks almost everywhere, for me, is a good idea. Don't want to overdo it because we want to leave enough room for the watercolours to have their play as well. And if we have too much mark, we'll end up with not enough space for our lovely colours. You might have noticed I blacked in the eye here, and we can also find the other darkest point of contrast, and we can literally black it in. So we could have 4 here, which is where we just have a total black area of ink. We find those darkest points, and we can just make something of them with our pen right now. Probably the same can be said of under a couple of these talons, and this is where things are starting to make sense, starting to come together. Do spend a little bit of time as well on the tree, just finding these little cracks, these other areas of really dark contrast, these other textures. And again, I think here, just using a little bit of simple hatching, and you can just even invent a few areas of light and dark, just to make the whole thing feel a little more interesting. And we can also just apply some shading all the way under the bottom of our branch, just to show the light is coming from the top. And by hatching and cross-hatching and being consistent, we'll immediately develop that shape in this little branch. A couple more little marks down here, just coming around. And I think that's it. We are done with our value with pen. And that means we can move on to our colour. So with our colour, the first stage is a loose wash of colour. And what we're actually trying to do in the next sort of 2 stages is build up layers. So the first stage is going to be loose. If I just take a nice sort of red colour here and I apply a little light wash, that's kind of what we're aiming for. We can do really thick paint and get those really dark values straight away. But if I just dry this, I'll show you why we don't want to do that. So instead of going straight for this, what we do is we wait for this first layer to dry. Then we can come in and we can apply a second layer on top, and we get a richer colour, but we still have that lovely translucency. Look how this feels muddy and dark, and the lines would be covered. And then we can let this dry again, and we can come back when it's dry, just like magic, and apply another layer. And just like that, we build up to these darker, deeper colours, but without having to get there straight away. And that lets us be subtle and clever. So, for example, as well, if we use the same colour, we do a nice little loose wash over here. Instead of just having a flat colour, because we're painting light and loose, we can make this interesting. We could add a little bit of orange in there. We could add a little bit of yellow, and suddenly our bland flat wash takes on those amazing watercolour properties. And that is the two reasons why we want to start loose, we want to start watery. So we don't make it muddy, so that we have the opportunity to make it interesting as well and let colours flow and blend together. So, before I forget, I'll just write here, 3 and 4, what we're doing is watercolours. And we're working in layers. So this is our layers, and again we could do this as a value scale. This is 1, 2, 3, and also we're doing a wet on wet approach, which I'll call wow, wet on wet, because it really is the way that we make our colours fantastic. And like that we can now jump in and look at our rubbing and find the colours we want to add. So I'm going to start with an orange. Now we can do orange with red and yellow, so we get a nice, hopefully a nice bright orange if we just keep our colours clear from other sources of colour. You can see my palette sometimes a little messy. So if I go at the top here, we've got this kind of nice orange. Or we can also use pre-mixed oranges. So I've got a Quattrone Sienna, which is a really nice orange. You can see you get similar effects. And it depends how lazy you're feeling, or if you have a particular favourite colour. Today I'll use the mixed colour. And we're going to start really light. So really gently pop that colour in. And don't worry if it goes other places, if it crosses over the lines. Then I can use the red and the yellow that I used to mix it. I can just dot that in, make it more interesting already. Next we've got these obvious browns. So now I'm going to use a little bit of my orange, but I'll bring it down a bit with some indigo. And that should get us to a more sort of murky brown colour. Because brown is just dark orange, really. It's toned down orange, orange with a little bit of black in, or a bit of depth of colour in there. And again, really gently, just wash that around. I can let those colours blend and mingle. And again, take that indigo and just drop it in a few places. Make this little chappy more interesting. Then in these greys, for me, there's actually a lot of blue. So I'm going to take a bit of cobalt blue, a kind of primary blue colour here. And I'm going to use that to start just suggesting some of these shadows, some of these things going on in this otherwise grey neutral area. We can even use a little bit of our indigo very lightly, very gently, and also we can leave some of it white. We don't have to paint the whole thing. In fact, it's often better not to paint the whole thing. Using these same colours, we can come in and we can just make our branch interesting. So some blues for the shadows, some of this brown, and then also introduce something a little different. Perhaps a nice and punchy green, which you could mix with yellow and blue, or you could have, like me, a couple of pre-mixed greens. Again, just depending on what you like to do, whether you're lazy like me or whether you have favourite colours. I have some favourite greens, so I just keep them in my palette. And there we go. So now we have our little bird. What I'm going to do as well is make him a little more interesting. Some of these splashes, start getting things moving and playing over the page so that we aren't too rigid. So we get some little splashes of our colour coming out of his belly. We can even get some of these bold blues coming out of the shadows. And that looseness, I think, is a really key part of this process. And we've kind of done now step 3, our loose colours. And we now want to let this dry so we can do step 4, where we start working on those simple layers. And don't worry, yes, at the moment this looks awful. That's the nature of watercolours. They take time to layer up. So one of the biggest learning things, apart from being able to simplify, is understanding that yes, things will look awful before they start looking really good, really fun, really lively. And we're back and we are drying. One thing you might notice is the watercolours have dried really pale. And that is what happens with watercolours. When you first paint them, they're much richer. When they've dried, they go soft. So often we worry we've gone too far, but all we need to do is take a step back, let it dry, and we'll see that we haven't. What we're going to do now is come back and start using these same colours. So we've got the oranges, we've got the browns, we've got our blues, and we're going to just start layering them up and getting this effect. So let's start with a nice bit of orange first, because that's where we started originally. And again, what I'm trying to do is make a nice crisp and clear orange. And then we can just bring it in. I'm going to use my flat brush now because it's got a finer point, and it's just something else to play with. It's an ability to make different kind of marks. And with that, we can start just going, look, where's our deepest oranges? and I can be a little bit more specific. And then I'm going to add a bit more red, changing up our wash again, just making it a tiny bit more interesting. And we can leave these brush marks, we can leave this to show the process of our sketching. Moving on, we've got this blue, and again, just find where do I think the shadows are, or where would the shadows not necessarily have to be in the reference, but where would they fit in my version of this bird. And I think getting some nice shadow underneath like that is working quite well, so I'll go with it. And again, we can then move on and quickly move on to our brown. Remember to mix the brown the same way and we should get a consistent result. And here we can start layering up the back and finding some of those deeper browns and things moving around. And a little bit here, a little bit there. And before long, we'll have filled in the sort of second layer, and immediately, hopefully you agree, he's taking on more life, he's richer. I'm going to keep just working different bits of these colours around, working from sort of lighter to darker colours, dropping in some of our little darker colours where I really want a punchy shadow, perhaps even dropping in some lighter colours, some bright reds and things where I want something more interesting to happen. Even these blues, I always think dropping in a little blue in places can really lift otherwise sort of dark and grumpy areas. We can use our brush to make a few textures as well, so we just use it. We can suggest some of these what are they called, feathers. Just like we did with our pen, we can start just doing little sort of feathery marks. And one thing I think we're missing is a nice bold bit of orange just around the eye here, because it is nice bright and orange there. Again, we could do something loose, something fun while we wait for these colours to dry. Perhaps just build on these little loose splurges of colour by touching in or splashing in some fun. Then going to move down, don't neglect the sort of the surroundings if you like. So we'll get our browns, our blues, our greens, and we'll just enrich this. We don't need to overpaint this, we don't want this to be as bold as our bird, because what we want is for our bird to kind of stand out. But by making it interesting, it just doesn't look neglected. So a few touches in here, a few touches here and there, just to make this feel a bit more interesting. And again, what I'm going to do, actually there's one more thing I'm going to do before this. So I can lift a bit of this colour. It's gone a little bit murky, so I'm going to just take my brush, dry it, and just lift a little bit of colour, and that can get us a nice feeling of light in a couple of places. And it's a technique well worth practicing. We can just pick out some of this colour, make it feel a bit more soft, a bit more natural, and get that kind of feeling of light back in our sketch. There you go. Going to let this dry, and then we'll be doing the kind of finishing touches with a last bit of layer and some other parts which make up those finishing touches in our ink and watercolour processes. So we are nice and dry, and as I said, we're going to be doing our finishing touches. So step 5, we'll still be layering some colours, but we'll also be restructuring our ink and adding some bold highlights. And when we restructure, what we're doing is we're taking a bolder pen, so everything's about bold pen plus bold colours, and that's how we finish off. So that's equals finishing touches. So hopefully it all sort of logically makes sense. And what we can do with our bolder pen, if we look at our thumbnail again, we can make lines more important. We can correct lines because it's bolder, because it's more got more emphasis. We can bring things forward. We can add real emphasis in places where it needs it. So I'm going to do that first. And what you might notice in our colours here is that because the colours are on top of the line, some of the lines have faded back. So what we can do here, we come round and we can re-identify those lines. So now this watercolour splurge just looks like a fun splurge because we've gone over that line and we've made it consistent again. Don't be too smooth. We don't want a smooth line. We have these lovely textured wobbly lines for our bird already. So keep those lovely textures, keep that little wobble, and just add something to your bird. Add a clarity to it. Coming round, we can do the same in the tail. Can come round here, do the same up here. Sometimes if the page is still wet, your pen might struggle to write. So here, my page is still a little bit wet. even though it's touch dry, there's still some moisture in there. So just give it a little bit longer to dry. I'm going to move away from that area to allow that. We can do some of the internal structure again. When we get to the internal structure, we can actually base our lines on what's happened with the colour. So for example, if you've got some of these little white areas, I can outline them to really show off that contrast. In here we've got these little bits of red which have created little lines. We can outline them to show off that contrast. Up here we can do the same, and again outlining some of the contrast, sort of making those watercolour lines, which are fairly random in our process, actually important part of the sketch. Make it look intentional. Don't overdo it though. We don't want to, at the point where we've got a lovely sketch, we don't want to suddenly make it super busy and overdone. Some of these textural marks where they're key to the feathers we can go over as well. Some of these little blue textures we put in. And you might find yourself wanting to increase some contrast as well with some darker pen. Again, don't neglect the surroundings. So even the feet, easy to forget about them in our focus on the rest of the bird. What we don't want to do is make this super bold so that it overtakes our bird. But what we do want to do is make it feel like it's part of the same image. So a little bit of extra boldness. And again, here we can find some of these little watercolour lines. We can kind of just draw around them. Little sort of, it's like paint by numbers in reverse. We've painted and then we'll pretend that we meant to paint these exact areas. And it just adds a kind of patchwork or slightly geometric effect, which just shows the processes that we've been taking part in as we've sketched. And there we go, we're almost finished. That's the bold pen. And now we've got our boldest colours. And what we're going to do with these is just take some really vivid mixes of our orange, so we get a really nice punchy vivid mix. And we can find these deepest, brightest areas. Again, you can see that's actually not bold enough because it was too yellow, so it wasn't standing up against the orange. And I'm actually going to make some sort of painterly marks. Painterly marks being where you can see the brush strokes. And I think that's a really fun part of painting. Not trying to make it super realistic, instead trying to show the processes you've been through. You're going to get a nice rich sort of brown here as well. We could do the same. Just a few little painterly marks. Again, showing the highlights but also showing the process. A little bit more of our indigo to get even darker down here. And we can do a bit of the same. And remember, these marks will dry softer, so although they look a bit punchy now, they will dry and they'll be more calm, they'll be more in the distance. A little bit of our blue, again just trying to make it nice, bright, interesting. And last bit again, what we can do, just soften in some of these edges. So we've got these painterly marks, and then some of them we can just come around, a little bit of a clean dry brush, we just soften into those edges. And then it makes them still a painterly mark, but not so abrupt, not so in your face about how they're doing it. And there we go. So the last thing I'm going to do, the very last bit, take my pen again, and look, let's just get this eye coming all the way forward, make it nice and bold, and just like that, I think our sketch is finished. So put my initials there. I like to hide my signature somewhere in the line work, and hopefully through this you've understood the sort of 5 different steps you can go through, how we can build up our sketch using ink, watercolours, and why we do each step. And these same process will help you with birds, with flowers, with streets, with everything. Just remembering these really simple processes. If you enjoy this, if you want to learn more, then check out the description below, where I have videos about value, videos about hatching, videos about layering your colours and softening your edges. Also, if you subscribe, I publish videos really regularly, so you'll find loads of useful hints, tips and tricks to follow along with. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel, because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.